The scorching sun bore down on Fort Stockton, Texas. As Lillian Archer wiped sweat from her brow, the sleeve of her faded work dress darkening with moisture. 3 months at the Rocking W Ranch had taught her one unmistakable truth: surviving as the only female ranch hand meant working twice as hard as any man and complaining half as much. It was 1876, and the West was still wild, lawless in places, and rarely kind to a woman alone. At 22, Lillian had already endured more than most women twice her age. The death of her parents to influenza back in Boston had left her with nothing but debts, and a ticket west purchased with the last of their savings. "Miss Archer," Calvin Reed's voice boomed across the ranch yard. The foreman of the Rocking W stood on the porch of the main house, his thick arms crossed over his chest, eyes narrowed as they always were when addressing her. "Those water barrels ain't gonna fill themselves." Lillian nodded, refusing to show any sign that his constant barking affected her. "Yes, sir. I'm on my way." She grabbed the yoke and buckets and headed toward the well. The wooden handle of the pump was hot to the touch, warmed by the relentless Texas sun. As she worked the handle, cool water finally splashing into her bucket, she felt rather than heard someone approach. "Let me help you with that, madam." The voice was deep but gentle, with a slight drawl that marked him as a local. Lillian turned to find a tall man with broad shoulders standing behind her. His hat was pulled low, shading eyes the color of a summer storm. A newcomer to the ranch, she would have remembered him otherwise. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied automatically. Independence was her shield here. The stranger smiled. "Name's Thomas Wade. Just hired on yesterday." Lillian nodded politely but continued pumping. "Lillian Archer." "I know," he said. "The only lady wrangler in 3 counties from what I hear." She shot him a cautious glance. Most men either ridiculed her position or tried to court her within minutes of meeting her. Wade seemed to be doing neither, simply stating a fact. "Not by choice," she admitted. "But it's honest work." "That it is." He leaned against the well housing. "Mind if I help anyway? Those barrels look mighty heavy for one person." Before she could protest, he took one of the filled buckets and lifted it as if it weighed nothing. "Where to?" Lillian pointed toward the bunkhouse. "The cooking barrels need filling first." They walked together, and for the first time in months, Lillian didn't feel like she was being measured, judged, or pursued. Wade carried the water in comfortable silence, his stride matching hers. "You're not from around here," she observed. "Colorado originally, been drifting south for a spell." He glanced at her. "You don't sound like Texas either." "Boston," she admitted. "Came west after my parents died." Wade nodded, his expression softening. "Tough journey for a woman alone." "The world doesn't stop for grief," Lillian replied, the words coming out more harshly than she'd intended. To her surprise, Wade simply nodded. "No, madam, it surely does not." For the next hour they worked together, filling water barrels around the ranch. Wade was efficient and respectful, maintaining a proper distance but making the work go faster than it ever had before. By the time they finished, Lillian found herself more at ease with him than with any man she'd met in Texas. "Archer," Calvin Reed's voice cut through their conversation. The foreman strode toward them, his face flushed with either sun or anger. "I don't pay you to fraternize. The mending pile is waiting and the cook needs help with supper." "Yes, Mr. Reed," she answered, stepping away from Wade. "And you, new blood," Reed continued, jabbing a thick finger at Wade's chest. "Blake wants you in the south pasture. Those fences won't mend themselves." Wade tipped his hat first to Reed, then to Lillian. "Madam," he said with quiet dignity before heading toward the barn. Reed watched him go, then turned his small, mean eyes to Lillian. "That one's trouble. You stay clear, you hear?" "I was just doing my chores, Mr. Reed." See that you keep it that way." He leaned closer, his breath hot and stinking of tobacco. "Old man Blake may think having a woman around is some kind of novelty, but I know what women are good for, and it ain't ranch work." Lillian stepped back, her heart pounding. It wasn't the first time Reed had made her uncomfortable, but something in his tone today sent a chill down her spine despite the heat. "I earn my keep same as any hand," she said firmly. Reed smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "We'll see about that, won't we?" He walked away, leaving Lillian with an uneasiness that persisted throughout the day. That evening, as the ranch hands gathered for supper in the mess hall, Lillian sat at her usual spot at the end of the table. Her status as the only woman meant she was both part of the crew and forever separate from it. She ate quickly, planning to retreat to her small private room attached to the cookhouse before the inevitable card games and storytelling began. She was rising to leave when Wade entered, late to supper after his work in the far pasture. Their eyes met briefly, and he nodded in acknowledgement. Something about his presence made her hesitate, and instead of leaving immediately, she sat back down. Old Joe, the cook, slapped a plate of beans and cornbread in front of Wade. "South pasture's a beast this time of year," the old man commented. "Reed working you hard already, boy," Wade shrugged. "Nothing harder than I've done before." "Where'd you ride in from?" asked Hank, one of the older hands, all over, most recently up from Lairdo Way. "What brings you to Fort Stockton?" another hand asked. "Not exactly on the main trails." Wade took a bite of cornbread before answering. "Heard Blake was hiring experienced hands. Pays fair, they say." "Fair enough," Hank agreed, "though Reed makes you earn every penny." As the men talked, Lillian observed Wade carefully. Unlike most drifters, he carried himself with quiet confidence rather than bravado. His clothes were worn but clean, his manners respectful without being obsequious. Most telling, he didn't stare at her like she was some curiosity or available conquest. After supper, as the men moved to the porch to smoke, Lillian found herself following, drawn by the pleasant evening air and, she had to admit, a desire to hear more from the newcomer. She took a seat on a wooden bench slightly apart from the men, darning a sock in the fading light. Wade leaned against a post, rolling a cigarette with practiced ease. The other hands were swapping tales of their day's work when the conversation turned, as it inevitably did in the West, to tales of adventure. "Wade here was just telling me he rode with the Rangers for a spell," Hank announced. Lillian's needle paused mid-stitch. The Texas Rangers were legendary lawmen of uncommon bravery and skill. Wade shook his head modestly. "Just for 2 years. Nothing heroic about it." "Rangers don't take just anybody," old Joe commented. "You must have had something they wanted, could track," Wade admitted. "And I'm a fair hand with a rifle." "More than fair, I'd wager," Hank pressed. Wade shrugged and changed the subject, asking about the ranch's cattle operation. Lillian found herself intrigued. Most men would have seized the opportunity to boast, especially to impress a woman, however indirectly. Wade's reticence spoke of a man comfortable with himself. As darkness fell completely, Lillian finally rose to retire. "Good night, gentlemen," she said quietly. A chorus of "night." Miss Archer followed her, but she felt Wade's eyes on her back as she walked toward her small room. Not a predatory gaze, but something thoughtful, almost protective. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without checking that her door was securely locked. Morning came with its usual rhythm, feeding the chickens, helping old Joe with breakfast, then receiving assignments from Reed. The foreman seemed particularly irritable, barking orders and criticizing everyone's work more harshly than usual. "Archer," he snapped as she crossed the yard. "Blake wants the ledgers updated. You're the only one with schooling enough to manage it. You'll work in the office today." Lillian nodded, surprised by the change in routine but not displeased. Working in the ranch house office meant escaping the worst of the heat. "Yes, sir," she replied. Reed's eyes lingered on her a beat too long. "Wear something decent. Can't have you looking like a field hand in the main house." Lillian hurried to her room, changing into the one dress she kept for Sundays, a simple blue cotton that was at least clean and whole, if not fashionable. She pinned her hair more carefully than usual and made her way to the main house. Edgar Blake, the ranch owner, was an elderly widower who spent most of his time in town, leaving the day-to-day operations to Reed. The ranch house stood empty most days, a grand but lonely monument to Blake's success. Reed met her at the door, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "This way," he said, leading her to the study. The ledgers were indeed in disarray, months of transactions recorded haphazardly if at all. Lillian sat at the desk and began organizing the scattered papers, relieved when Reed finally left her to the work. Hours passed as she meticulously recorded purchases, sales, and wages. The ranch was doing well, she realized, better than Reed had led the hands to believe when he'd announced there would be no bonuses after the spring drive. She was so absorbed in her calculations that she didn't hear Reed return until he was standing directly behind her chair. "Finding everything?" he asked, his voice uncomfortably close to her ear. Lillian stiffened. "Yes, sir. I've nearly caught up through April." His hand came down on her shoulder, heavy and possessive. "Smart girl like you is wasted out there with the livestock." She tried to shrug away from his touch, but his grip tightened. "Mr. Reed, I should get back to Blake's thinking of making me partner," he interrupted, his other hand now resting on the back of her chair, effectively trapping her. "A man in that position needs a proper woman, not some ranch drudge." Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs. "Please step back, Mr. Reed." Instead, he leaned closer, his breath hot on her neck. "I could make things very comfortable for you, Lillian, very comfortable indeed." "I'm not interested," she said firmly, standing and trying to put the chair between them. Reed's face darkened. "Not interested," he mimicked, his tone ugly. "You're a woman alone in a man's world. You don't have the luxury of not being interested." He moved around the chair with surprising speed for a man of his bulk, grabbing her arm roughly. "I've been patient, watching you parade around this ranch like you're too good for any man here." "Let me go," Lillian demanded, trying to pull away. Reed's grip tightened painfully. "Nobody's coming, Lillian. The men are all out working. Old Joe's deaf as a post. It's just you and me." Fear turned to panic as he pushed her against the desk, his body pinning her there. Lillian fought, scratching at his face and arms, but he was so much stronger. "Stop fighting," he growled, one hand grabbing at the neckline of her dress. "You'll thank me later when you're the foreman's woman instead of mucking stalls." The fabric tore with a sickening rip. Lillian screamed, a sound born of terror and rage. Reed slapped her, hard enough to make her ears ring. "Shut up, you little—" "Take your hands off her." The voice, low and dangerous, came from the doorway. Reed froze, then slowly turned, still keeping Lillian pinned against the desk. Thomas Wade stood there, his tall frame filling the doorway, eyes cold as steel. "This doesn't concern you, Wade," Reed snarled. "Get back to your duties." Wade stepped into the room, his movements deliberate, controlled. "Let her go." Reed's face contorted with rage. "I'm the foreman here." "You're nothing but hired help. Get out before I fire you on the spot." "Fire me then." Wade took another step forward. "But take your hands off Miss Archer first." Lillian felt Reed's grip loosen slightly as his attention divided between her and the threat Wade presented. She seized the moment, bringing her knee up hard between Reed's legs. The foreman doubled over with a howl of pain, and Lillian slipped free, clutching the torn bodice of her dress. Reed recovered quickly, straightening with murder in his eyes. "You'll regret that," he spat, reaching for her again. Wade moved with startling speed, stepping between them. His hand shot out, gripping Reed's wrist in what must have been a painful hold. "She's protected now," Wade said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable promise of violence. "Touch her again, and it'll be the last thing you do." Reed's face purpled with rage. "You're both finished here, I'll see to it." "I don't think so." Wade's grip tightened until Reed winced. "See, I've been watching you, Reed. Skimming from the cattle sales, shorting the men's pay, lying to Blake about the profits. I reckon those ledgers Miss Archer's been working on tell an interesting story." Reed's expression flickered from rage to uncertainty. "You can't prove anything." "I don't need to," Wade replied evenly. "Because we're going to walk out of here, Miss Archer and I, and you're going to leave this ranch by sundown. Otherwise, I'm riding straight to Fort Stockton to find Blake and the sheriff." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Reed wrenched his arm free, his gaze shifting between them. "This isn't over," he threatened, backing toward the door. "It is for you," Wade answered. Once Reed had gone, Wade turned to Lillian, his expression immediately softening. "Are you hurt, Miss Archer?" She shook her head, though her cheek throbbed where Reed had struck her. "How did you know?" "I came to deliver a message from Hank. Saw Reed follow you in here hours ago, then leave looking mighty pleased with himself. When he went back." Wade's jaw tightened. "I had a bad feeling." Lillian clutched at her torn dress. "Thank you." Wade removed his jacket and offered it to her. "We should find somewhere safer. Reed's the type to lash out when cornered." She slipped the jacket on gratefully, drowning in its size but comforted by its warmth and the clean, masculine scent of leather and sun. "The bunkhouse," she suggested. Wade shook his head. "Too isolated if Reed comes back with a gun. The cookhouse, old Joe's there, and it's closer to where the hands are working." As they left the main house, Lillian spotted Reed storming toward the barn, his movements jerky with rage. "He's not leaving," she observed nervously. "No," Wade agreed grimly. "I didn't expect him to." They hurried to the cookhouse, where old Joe was preparing the evening meal. The elderly cook took one look at Lillian's face and Wade's protective stance and understood immediately. "Reed?" he asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. Wade nodded. He tried to force himself on Miss Archer. The old cook spat on the floor. "That snake. Been watching him eye her for months." He turned to Lillian. "You all right, girl?" "I will be," she answered, trying to steady her still shaking hands. Old Joe nodded toward his small bedroom off the kitchen. "You can rest in there, Miss Archer. I'll keep watch." "I need to gather the other hands," Wade said. "Reed's not the type to go quietly." As Wade turned to leave, Lillian caught his arm. "Be careful, he's dangerous." Something flickered in Wade's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at her concern, followed by a warmth that made her breath catch. "I've faced worse," he assured her. The next hour passed in tense waiting. Old Joe gave Lillian one of his clean shirts to replace her torn dress beneath Wade's jacket. The elderly cook busied himself with supper preparations, but his eyes constantly darted to the windows, watching for trouble. "Been with this outfit 15 years, he told Lillian as he chopped potatoes. "Never did trust Reed. Blake's too old and trusting to see what's under his nose." "He's been stealing," Lillian confirmed. "The ledgers show it plain as day." Old Joe nodded grimly. "Figured as much. Men talk about how the drives bring less than expected, but cattle prices are good this year." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Lillian saw Wade returning with Hank and 3 other hands. Their faces were serious, hands hovering near their sidearms. The kitchen door banged open and Wade entered, his expression tight. Reed's holed up in the barn. Says he won't leave without settling scores. He's been drinking, Hank added, following Wade inside. Found his private stash of whiskey empty. Lillian's stomach knotted with fear. What will you do? We outnumber him, Wade said. But a cornered drunk man with a gun is unpredictable. Blake needs to know, Old Joe said. This is his spread, his problem. Jameson's riding to town to fetch him and the sheriff, Hank explained. But it'll be hours before they arrive. The sound of breaking glass shattered the tense atmosphere. Outside, Reed had emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, and shot out a window of the main house. Come out, Wade, he bellowed, swaying slightly. You and that high and mighty Boston whore, Wade's face hardened. Stay inside, he told Lillian. All of you. You can't go out there alone, she protested. I won't engage him, Wade promised. Just need to keep him talking until he sobers up or help arrives. Before she could object further, Wade slipped outside, moving to the side of the cookhouse where Reed couldn't immediately spot him. Reed, he called. Put down the rifle, this doesn't have to end badly. The foreman spun, searching for the source of Wade's voice. Show yourself, Ranger, or are you hiding behind a woman's skirts? No one needs to get hurt, Wade continued, shifting positions again, keeping Reed turning and confused. Blake will be here soon. You can explain your side to him. Reed fired in the direction of Wade's voice, the bullet splintering wood somewhere to the right of the cookhouse. There's only one way this ends, Reed shouted. With you dead and that woman learning her place. Inside the cookhouse, Lillian watched through the window, her heart in her throat. Hank and the other hands had drawn their revolvers but remained indoors as Wade had instructed, unwilling to escalate the situation further. Reed stumbled toward the cookhouse, his rifle sweeping back and forth. I know she's in there. Send her out and maybe I'll let the rest of you live. Wade appeared at the corner of the bunkhouse, deliberately drawing Reed's attention away from the cookhouse. It's just you and me, Reed. The foreman swung his rifle toward Wade, who ducked behind the building just as Reed fired. The shot went wild, hitting nothing. Coward, Reed roared, staggering forward. Lillian saw her chance. While Reed focused on Wade, she slipped past Hank to the back door of the cookhouse. Old Joe's rifle stood in the corner and she grabbed it, checking quickly to ensure it was loaded. Miss Archer, no, Old Joe hissed, but she was already outside, moving quietly along the back of the cookhouse. Reed was still shouting threats, working himself into a greater frenzy with each passing moment. Wade continued to lead him away from the cookhouse, drawing him toward the empty corral where there was less chance of anyone else being hit by stray bullets. Lillian circled behind the water trough, rifle ready. She wasn't aiming to kill, just to stop Reed before he could harm Wade or anyone else. Her father had taught her to shoot back in Boston, believing every woman should know how to defend herself. It was perhaps the only time that particular skill might save her life. Reed fired again, the bullet kicking up dust near Wade's feet. Wade had drawn his revolver but held his fire, still trying to talk the foreman down. Think, man, Wade called. Is this worth hanging for? Should have minded your own business, Reed snarled, raising his rifle for another shot. Lillian stepped into view, the rifle steady in her hands. Drop it, Reed, the foreman whirled toward her new threat, momentarily confused by her appearance. That split second was all Wade needed. He lunged forward, tackling Reed to the ground. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as the two men crashed to the dirt. What Reed lacked in sobriety, he made up for in rage and bulk. He landed a solid punch to Wade's jaw, sending him reeling. Reed scrambled for the fallen rifle, but Lillian was already there, kicking it beyond his reach. Reed switched targets instantly, lunging for her instead. Lillian swung the butt of Old Joe's rifle, catching Reed on the shoulder. He howled but didn't slow, grabbing for her throat with murderous intent. Wade recovered in time, driving his fist into Reed's kidney. The foreman arched in pain, releasing Lillian. She stumbled back, still gripping the rifle as the two men grappled in the dirt. Hank and the other hands rushed from the cookhouse, drawn by the gunfire. They formed a circle around the fighting men, weapons drawn but unable to intervene without risking Wade's safety. Reed was stronger, but Wade was quicker and more skilled. He maneuvered out of Reed's grasp, landing precise blows that gradually wore the bigger man down. Blood streamed from a cut above Wade's eye, and his lip was split, but he fought with the controlled precision of a man accustomed to violence. Reed, growing desperate, reached for a knife in his boot. The blade flashed in the late afternoon sun as he slashed wildly at Wade. "Look out!" Lillian cried. Wade twisted away from the knife, but not quite fast enough. The blade caught his arm, slicing through his shirt and drawing a line of crimson across his bicep. The sight of Wade's blood triggered something in Lillian. Without conscious thought, she raised the rifle and fired a single shot into the ground inches from Reed's head. Everyone froze. Reed's eyes, wild with rage and fear, fixed on her. "The next one goes through your skull," Lillian said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Reed weighed his options, looking from Lillian's unwavering rifle to Wade's bleeding arm to the circle of armed ranch hands surrounding them. Slowly, he dropped the knife. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "All of you." Blake will what?" came a new voice. An elderly man on horseback approached from the direction of town, accompanied by a younger man wearing a sheriff's badge. Edgar Blake, the ranch owner, surveyed the scene with shrewd eyes that belied his advanced age. "Mr. Blake," Reed began, his tone immediately changing to one of injured innocence. "These people have turned against me." "I was just trying to maintain order, save it," Blake interrupted, dismounting stiffly. "Sheriff Coleman and I passed young Jameson on the road. He told us enough." The sheriff moved forward, drawing handcuffs from his belt. "Calvin Reed, you're under arrest for assault and attempted murder." "This is ridiculous," Reed protested as the sheriff secured his wrists. "It's her word against mine, and she's nothing but it's all our words," Wade interrupted, stepping forward despite his bleeding arm. "And the ranch ledgers show your theft clear as day." Blake turned to Lillian, his expression softening with concern. "Miss Archer, are you injured?" She shook her head, suddenly aware of how she must look wearing old Joe's oversized shirt beneath Wade's jacket, her hair disheveled, hands still gripping the rifle. "No, sir, thanks to Mr. Wade." Blake nodded, then addressed the assembled ranch hands. "I owe you all an apology. I trusted the wrong man to run this ranch in my absence." As the sheriff led a still protesting Reed to his horse, Blake turned to Wade. "Jameson mentioned you were once a ranger. That true?" Wade nodded. "Yes, sir." 2 years with Company D. "Why'd you leave?" "Got tired of killing," Wade answered simply. "Wanted honest work that didn't involve a gun." Blake considered this, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "This ranch needs a new foreman, someone the men respect and who knows right from wrong." "Would you consider the position?" Wade looked genuinely surprised. "Sir, I've only been here a week." "Sometimes a week tells you more about a man than a year," Blake replied. "Think on it. Let me know by morning." As Blake moved away to speak with the sheriff, Lillian finally lowered the rifle, her arms trembling with delayed reaction. Wade approached her, concern evident in his expression despite his own injuries. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Lillian tried to nod but found tears threatening instead. "I should be asking you that," she managed, gesturing to his bleeding arm. Wade glanced at the wound dismissively. "It's nothing but you." He hesitated, then gently took the rifle from her hands. That was brave. Foolish, maybe, but brave. I couldn't let him hurt you, she said simply, the words escaping before she could consider their implications. Something shifted in Wade's gaze, a softening, a recognition. Before he could respond, old Joe hurried over. Lord above, what a mess, the cook muttered. Come on, both of you. Those cuts need tending, and Miss Archer looks ready to collapse. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. The sheriff departed with Reed in custody. Blake announced he would stay at the ranch for a few days to sort things out. Old Joe insisted on treating Wade's knife wound, while Hank brought Lillian a cup of strong, sweet tea that helped steady her nerves. As night fell, the ranch gradually quieted. Lillian, having changed back into her work clothes, sat alone on the cookhouse porch, watching stars appear in the velvet sky. The events of the day played through her mind on endless repeat. Reed's attack, Wade's intervention, the fight, the rifle in her hands. Footsteps on the wooden steps announced Wade's arrival. He'd cleaned up, his hair still damp from washing, a fresh bandage visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "May I join you?" he asked. Lillian nodded, moving over to make room on the bench. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the ranch washing over them, distant cattle lowing, the soft whicker of horses in the corral, the chirp of crickets. "Mr. Blake offered me the foreman position again at supper," Wade finally said. "Seems determined to have an answer tonight. Will you take it?" Lillian asked, trying to keep her tone neutral despite the sudden flutter in her chest. Wade turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "Depends." "On what?" "On whether you're staying." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. "Why would that matter to you?" she asked softly. Wade's gaze remained steady on hers. "Because in one day, you've shown more courage and principle than most men I've known in a lifetime. Because I'd like to know you better, Miss Archer. Much better." Heat rose to Lillian's cheeks that had nothing to do with the warm evening. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted, "and I've grown accustomed to ranch life despite everything." "It would be different with Reed gone," Wade said. "No more working twice as hard to prove yourself, no more looking over your shoulder. Are you offering me protection, Mr. Wade?" There was a hint of challenge in her voice. He smiled slightly. "No, madam, you've proven you can protect yourself. I'm offering you respect. And if you're willing, my company from time to time." Lillian found herself smiling in return. "I think I'd like that." "Then I'll accept Blake's offer," Wade decided, "if you'll agree to one condition." "What's that?" "Call me Thomas. Mr. Wade makes me feel like my father." Lillian laughed, the sound surprising her after the tension of the day. "Only if you'll call me Lillian." "Lillian," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name. "It suits you, strong but beautiful." She ducked her head, unaccustomed to such direct compliments. "Thank you for what you did today, Thomas. Not many men would have risked themselves for a woman they barely know." "I know enough," he replied quietly. "I know you're brave and skilled and determined. I know you don't belong mucking stalls when you can read ledgers and shoot straight." "What are you suggesting?" Thomas leaned back, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Blake mentioned needing someone to manage the ranch books properly. Said Reed's record-keeping was a mess even before you sorted through it today." Lillian's pulse quickened. "A proper position. Not just odd jobs and favors. With proper wages," Thomas confirmed. "Blake seemed quite impressed by what you discovered in just one day of examining the accounts." Hope, an emotion Lillian had carefully guarded against since her parents' deaths, began to bloom in her chest. "I'd like that very much." "Then it's settled," Thomas said. "You'll keep the books, I'll manage the hands, and maybe—" He hesitated, then pushed forward with characteristic directness. "Maybe we could have supper together sometimes, just the two of us." Lillian looked at him, this man who had stepped between her and danger without hesitation, who offered her respect instead of protection, opportunity instead of charity. "I'd like that too," she said softly. Thomas's smile in response was worth all the hardship she'd endured to reach this moment, this place, this man. The following weeks brought dramatic changes to the Rocking W Ranch. With Reed gone, a palpable sense of relief spread among the hands. Thomas Wade proved to be a fair and capable foreman, earning the men's respect through hard work rather than intimidation. Lillian moved from her small room by the cookhouse into a proper bedroom in the ranch house. Blake, impressed by her bookkeeping skills, officially appointed her as the ranch's accountant. For the first time since arriving in Texas, she felt truly valued for her abilities rather than merely tolerated. Thomas was true to his word about supper. Twice a week, they would meet on the ranch house porch after the day's work was done, sharing a meal and conversation away from the other hands. These evenings quickly became the highlight of Lillian's week. "My father was a banker," she told Thomas one evening in late July as they watched a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and crimson. "He taught me bookkeeping from the time I was old enough to add numbers." "He'd be proud to see you now," Thomas observed, passing her a plate of Old Joe's fried chicken. "You've saved Blake a small fortune already, identifying where Reed was skimming." Lillian smiled, warmed by his words. "What about your family? You rarely speak of them." A shadow crossed Thomas's face. "Not much to tell. Father was a farmer in Colorado. Mother died when I was 12. Father followed when I was 17. Worked the farm until drought took it, then drifted south, doing whatever work I could find." "And the Rangers?" she prompted gently. Thomas gazed into the distance. "Joined up at 20. Thought I was doing something noble, bringing law to lawless places." He sighed. "Discovered it wasn't always that simple. Left after 2 years when an order to pursue a band of Comanche ended with women and children dead. Couldn't stomach it anymore." Lillian reached out impulsively, placing her hand over his. "I'm sorry." He turned his hand to clasp hers, his rough palm warm against her skin. "Don't be. It led me here, didn't it?" The simple touch of his hand sent a current through Lillian's body. They had been careful with physical contact during their suppers, maintaining a respectful distance, despite the growing closeness between them. But tonight, with the setting sun casting its golden light over them and the ranch peaceful around them, the moment felt suspended in time, full of possibility. Thomas seemed to feel it too. His eyes, usually guarded when speaking of his past, softened as they held hers. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned toward her. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a demand. Lillian answered by leaning into him, her free hand rising to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since that first day at the well," he admitted. Lillian smiled. "Why didn't you?" "Wasn't sure you'd welcome it. Still not entirely sure." She laughed softly. "For a former Ranger, you can be remarkably unobservant, Thomas Wade." His answering smile was boyish, lighting his usually serious features. "I'll try to be more perceptive in the future, madam." As August faded into September, their relationship deepened. Edgar Blake, seeing the change between them, raised no objections. If anything, the elderly rancher seemed pleased by the development. "Ranch this size needs a family at its heart," he commented to Lillian one morning as they reviewed the monthly accounts. "Been too long since there were children running around this place." Lillian blushed furiously, but Blake just chuckled and returned to the ledgers. The news of their courtship spread quickly among the ranch hands. who treated it with varying degrees of good-natured teasing and genuine congratulations. Only a few, who had harbored their own hopes regarding Lillian, showed any resentment, but even they couldn't deny that Wade had earned his place both as foreman and in Lillian's affections. One crisp October evening, Thomas asked Lillian to ride with him to a spot he'd discovered on the ranch's northern boundary. They set out after the day's work was completed, following a narrow trail that wound through scrubby mesquite and prickly pear cactus. "Are you planning to get us lost?" Lillian teased as the ranch buildings disappeared from view. Thomas grinned over his shoulder. "Have some faith, Boston. I haven't steered you wrong yet, have I?" After 20 minutes of riding, they emerged onto a small rise overlooking a hidden spring. Cottonwood trees, their leaves turning golden with autumn, surrounded the water, creating a natural haven in the harsh landscape. Thomas had clearly prepared for their arrival. A blanket was spread beneath the largest tree, and a small basket sat nearby. "Thomas," Lillian breathed, taking in the peaceful beauty of the spot. "How did you find this place?" "Checking fence lines last week," he explained, helping her dismount. "Thought you might appreciate somewhere away from the ranch for a change." They settled on the blanket, and Thomas unpacked the basket: bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a bottle of wine that must have cost him a week's wages. "This is lovely," Lillian said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. Thomas seemed unusually nervous, fumbling slightly with the wine cork. After they'd eaten, he grew quiet, his gaze fixed on the spring's clear water. "Is something wrong?" Lillian finally asked. Thomas took a deep breath, then turned to face her. "Lillian, I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures. I've led a simple life, sometimes a hard one. But these past months with you—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "They've been the best of my life." Lillian's heart began to race. "Mine too," she said softly. Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I rode into Fort Stockton yesterday," he explained, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold ring. "It's not elaborate, but it's perfect," Lillian interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. "I haven't asked yet," Thomas pointed out, a smile tugging at his lips. "Then ask," she whispered. Thomas took her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "Lillian Archer, will you marry me? Become my wife, my partner, the mother of my children someday?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit. As Thomas pulled her into his arms, Lillian marveled at the journey that had brought her here, from grief-stricken Boston girl to confident Western woman, from lonely outsider to beloved partner. Their kiss sealed the promise, tender at first, then deepening with the certainty of their shared future. As the setting sun painted the spring in amber light, Lillian knew she had found not just protection in Thomas Wade's arms, but something far more precious: a home. News of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch and into Fort Stockton. Edgar Blake insisted on hosting the wedding at the ranch, inviting not only the hands but prominent families from town as well. "This ranch hasn't seen a proper celebration in 20 years, the old man declared. "About time we changed that." Lillian found herself suddenly at the center of attention among the town's women, who had previously viewed her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion due to her unusual position at the ranch. Now they embraced her as one of their own, offering advice, assistance, and friendship as she prepared for her wedding. Martha Coleman, the sheriff's wife, took particular interest in Lillian's welfare. "Every bride needs a proper dress," she insisted, accompanying Lillian to Fort Stockton's only dressmaker. "And you shall have the finest we can manage." The weeks leading up to the December wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Thomas threw himself into building and furnishing a small but sturdy house near the main ranch buildings, their future home. Blake offered us rooms in the main house, he explained as he showed Lillian the nearly completed structure. But I thought you might prefer our own place. Lillian walked through the simple rooms, touching the walls Thomas had raised with his own hands. A bedroom, a kitchen with a proper stove, a small sitting room with a stone fireplace. It was modest but perfect. I love it, she told him, meaning every word. It feels like home already. The night before their wedding, a rare winter storm blew in from the north, dusting Fort Stockton with a light covering of snow, an event so unusual that many of the ranch hands viewed it as a good omen. "White wedding for the Boston girl," old Joe commented with a wink. Bringing her weather with her. The morning dawned clear and crisp, the snow glittering under a bright December sun. Lillian stood in her room in the main house, Martha Coleman and several other women helping her prepare. Her wedding dress, cream-colored silk trimmed with lace that had been ordered specially from San Antonio, rustled softly as Martha fastened the last buttons. "You look beautiful, my dear," the sheriff's wife said, stepping back to admire the effect. "Absolutely radiant." Lillian gazed at her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the elegant woman who looked back at her. Gone was the dusty, work-worn ranch hand who had arrived in Fort Stockton nearly a year ago. In her place stood a confident bride, eyes bright with anticipation. A knock at the door announced Blake's arrival. The elderly rancher had asked for the honor of giving Lillian away in the absence of her own father. "My word," he exclaimed when he saw her. "Thomas Wade is a fortunate man indeed." Lillian took his offered arm, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Blake. For the job, the home, this day." "Nonsense," he replied gruffly, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "You and Wade have brought life back to this old place. I'm the one who should be grateful." The ceremony took place in the ranch's main room, transformed by evergreen boughs and red ribbons into a festive space that belied its usual practical function. Thomas waited at the far end, standing tall and handsome in a new black suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. When Lillian entered on Blake's arm, a hush fell over the assembled guests. Thomas's expression as he watched her approach was one Lillian knew she would remember until her dying day: wonder, joy, and love so plainly written on his face that tears sprang to her eyes. The local preacher kept the service brief, perhaps sensing the couple's eagerness to begin their life together. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas's kiss was both reverent and promising, drawing good-natured cheers from the ranch hands. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by old Joe and the town's women. A fiddler and banjo player from Fort Stockton provided music for dancing. Even Sheriff Coleman took a turn on the makeshift dance floor, waltzing with his plump, smiling wife. As midnight approached, Thomas found Lillian by the punch bowl, slipping his arm around her waist. "Had enough celebrating, Mrs. Wade," he murmured in her ear. The name sent a thrill through her. "Mrs. Wade," she repeated softly. "I'm still getting used to that." "We have a lifetime for you to practice," he replied, his eyes darkening with promise. "But right now, I'd like to take my wife home." They slipped away with minimal teasing, hurrying through the crisp night air to their new house. Thomas paused at the door, then swept Lillian into his arms. "Tradition," he explained with a grin as he carried her across the threshold. Inside, the fireplace blazed with welcome warmth. Thomas had clearly prepared for their arrival: fresh linens on the bed, a bottle of wine on the small table, a vase of winter greenery adding a touch of beauty to their first night home. "When did you do all this?" Lillian asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. "This morning while you were getting ready." Thomas set her gently on her feet, his hands lingering at her waist. I wanted everything to be perfect. Lillian reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. It is perfect. You are perfect. Thomas turned his head to kiss her palm. I'm far from perfect, Lillian, but I promise to try to be the man you deserve every day of our lives together. Their kiss deepened, months of restrained desire finally finding expression. With gentle hands, Thomas helped her out of her wedding dress, his reverent touch leaving no doubt of his love and respect. Their wedding night became a tender exploration, a joining of bodies that had already joined in heart and purpose. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Thomas's arms holding her close against his chest, Lillian reflected on the unlikely path that had brought her to this moment. The loss that had driven her west, the hardships she'd endured, even Reed's terrible attack, all had led her here to this man, this life, this perfect contentment. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, his voice low in the darkness. Lillian smiled, though he couldn't see it. "That sometimes protection comes in unexpected forms, and that I'm very glad you stepped between Reed and me that day." Thomas's arms tightened around her. "Best decision I ever made." Spring brought new beginnings to the rocking W. The winter rains had blessed the range with abundant grass, and calving season was the most successful in the ranch's history. Edgar Blake, growing frailer but still sharp-minded, began to rely more heavily on Thomas's judgment regarding ranch operations. "Won't be around forever," the old man confided to Lillian one afternoon as they worked on the quarterly accounts. "Need to know the place will be in good hands." Lillian had grown genuinely fond of Blake, whose gruff exterior hid a kind heart. "Thomas will take good care of the ranch, Mr. Blake. You know that." "I do." Blake hesitated, then added, "Been changing my will. No family left, you know. Been thinking the rocking W should go to folks who love it." The implication was clear, though Blake didn't state it directly. Lillian squeezed the elderly rancher's hand, too moved to speak. By summer, Lillian had news of her own. She told Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch of their small house, watching fireflies rise from the grass. "I think we'll need to add another room to the house," she said casually. Thomas looked at her quizzically, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "Lillian, are you saying?" She nodded, unable to contain her smile. "Dr. Morris confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Thomas, in January." Thomas's whoop of joy brought old Joe hurrying from the cookhouse, certain something was wrong. Finding instead his foreman dancing his laughing wife around the yard, the cook shook his head in mock disgust. "Lord save us from newlyweds," he grumbled, though his weathered face creased in a smile as he returned to his kitchen. That night, as Thomas held her close in bed, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, he whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" Lillian asked. "For coming west. For being brave enough to take on ranch work. For standing up to Reed that day." He kissed her temples softly. "For making me the happiest man in Texas." The months of Lillian's pregnancy passed peacefully. Thomas added not one but 2 rooms to their house, a nursery and a small study where Lillian could work on the ranch accounts, without traveling to the main house in bad weather. News from town brought word that Calvin Reed had been sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary for his crimes. The former foreman had made threats at his trial, swearing vengeance on Wade and his woman when he was released, but such concerns seemed distant in the face of their present happiness. December brought a harsh winter, with temperatures dropping lower than anyone in Fort Stockton could remember. Thomas insisted Lillian remain indoors as much as possible, fussing over her growing belly with such tender concern that she sometimes had to remind him she wasn't made of china. "The baby and I are fine." she assured him one stormy evening as he built up the fire for the third time. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know. Not my baby, Thomas replied stubbornly. And not my wife. Christmas came and went with a small celebration in their home, joined by Blake and several of the hands who had no family nearby. Old Joe outdid himself with the Christmas dinner, and Thomas presented Lillian with a beautiful cradle he had crafted in secret over the past months. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Where did you learn such fine woodworking?" "My grandfather was a carpenter," Thomas explained. "Taught me a few things before he passed." The baby, apparently impatient to try out its new cradle, arrived 3 days later. The birth was difficult, lasting through a long winter night while a blue norther howled outside. Martha Coleman, who had come to serve as midwife, ordered an increasingly frantic Thomas out of the bedroom after his pacing threatened to wear a hole in the floorboards. Near dawn, as the storm finally began to abate, a lusty cry announced the arrival of William Thomas Wade, a healthy boy with a shock of dark hair and his mother's determined chin. When Martha finally allowed Thomas back into the room, he approached the bed with uncharacteristic hesitation. Lillian, exhausted but radiant, held out their son. "Meet your boy, Thomas," she said softly. Thomas took the tiny bundle with hands that trembled slightly. As he gazed down at his son's face, a single tear tracked down his weathered cheek. "Hello, William," he whispered. "I'm your pa." The tenderness in his voice made Lillian fall in love with him all over again. This strong, capable man who had faced down danger without flinching was utterly undone by 7 pounds of new life. "He's perfect," Thomas said, carefully returning the baby to Lillian's arms. "Just like his mother." Life settled into a new rhythm with William's arrival. The baby thrived, growing quickly into a sturdy infant with his father's serious expression and his mother's curious nature. Lillian gradually resumed her work with the ranch accounts, often with William sleeping in a basket beside her desk. Edgar Blake doted on the child as if he were his own grandson, bringing gifts from town and spending hours watching the baby sleep. "Never thought I'd live to see children at the rocking W again," the old man confessed one afternoon. "Does my heart good." In April, when William was 3 months old, Blake called Thomas and Lillian to his study. His health had declined over the winter and he moved slowly now, relying on a cane. "Sit down," he instructed, settling himself behind his desk. "Got something important to discuss." Thomas and Lillian exchanged concerned glances as they took their seats. Blake didn't waste time on preamble. "Doctor says my heart's giving out. Might have a year, might have less." "Mr. Blake," Lillian began, but he raised a hand to stop her. "No platitudes, please. I've had a good long life, but I need to set my affairs in order." He pushed a document across the desk. "This is my will. Had it drawn up in Fort Stockton last month. Makes you two the heirs to the rocking W, lock, stock, and barrel." Thomas stared at the paper, stunned. "Sir, we can't possibly, can and will," Blake interrupted firmly. "No blood family left to leave it to. You two love this land, know how to work it right, and that boy of yours deserves a legacy." His gaze softened. "Consider it payment for bringing life back to an old man's final years." There was nothing to do but accept with gratitude, though both Thomas and Lillian privately hoped it would be many years before the will came into effect. Life continued to unfold with the rhythm of the seasons. William grew from infant to toddler, running on sturdy legs across the ranch yard, beloved by every hand. Lillian discovered she was expecting their second child as William's second birthday approached. "Hope it's a girl this time," Thomas commented, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Pretty as her mama." Edgar Blake lived to see the birth of Catherine Lillian Wade in February of 1879, holding the tiny girl in his gnarled hands with a look of wonder on his face. "Seems to me I've been blessed beyond all deserving," the old rancher said, carefully returning the infant to Lillian's arms. It was the last time they saw him fully conscious. Blake passed peacefully in his sleep 3 days later, leaving the rocking W to the family he had chosen. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges. The ranch prospered under Thomas's management and Lillian's careful accounting. They added a third child, another boy, James Edgar, in 1881. The children grew strong and healthy in the clean Texas air, learning ranching skills alongside their letters and numbers. Calvin Reed was released from prison in 1881, and for a few tense months, the ranch operated with additional guards and precautions. But Reed never appeared in Fort Stockton. Word eventually reached them that he had headed to New Mexico Territory, where he died in a saloon brawl less than a year after his release. As the children grew, so did the legacy Blake had entrusted to them. The Rocking W expanded its operations, acquiring additional grazing lands and building a reputation for quality stock throughout West Texas. Thomas and Lillian worked as true partners, her business acumen complementing his practical ranching knowledge. In 1886, as they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Lillian with a trip to Boston, her first return to her childhood home since her parents' deaths. "Time to show the children where their mother comes from," he explained, "and maybe make peace with some ghosts." The journey east was eye-opening for all of them. William, Catherine, and little James marveled at the busy streets and tall buildings of Boston, so different from the open spaces of their Texas home. Lillian visited her parents' graves, introducing her family to the grandparents they had never known. "They would have loved you all so much," she told her children as they placed flowers on the simple headstones. "Especially your father." Thomas, standing respectfully behind his family, met her eyes over the children's heads. A decade of marriage had only deepened their connection, their love maturing like fine wine with the passing years. "I wish I could have known them," he said quietly. Thanked them for raising such an extraordinary daughter. Returning to Texas after a month away, Lillian was surprised by how completely the Rocking W had become home. The familiar silhouette of the ranch buildings against the western sky filled her with contentment as their wagon approached. "Happy to be back?" Thomas asked, noting her smile. "Very," she replied, reaching for his hand. "Boston was where I began, but this is where I belong." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch of the house that had grown along with their family, Thomas's arm around Lillian's shoulders as they enjoyed the cool evening breeze. "Did you ever imagine this?" Lillian asked, gesturing toward their prosperous ranch. "When you rode in that day and helped me at the well," Thomas smiled, the years having softened but not diminished his handsome features. "Not in my wildest dreams. I was just a drifter with a troubled past, looking for honest work." "And I was just a frightened Boston girl pretending to be brave," Lillian added. "No," Thomas corrected her gently. "You were truly brave, still are. Bravest woman I've ever known." Lillian leaned into his embrace, thinking of all they had built together from that fateful moment when he had stepped between her and danger, offering protection that had blossomed into so much more. "You remember what you said that day, when Reed had me cornered in the office?" Thomas nodded, his arm tightening around her. "She's protected now," he quoted softly. "I didn't know then that you weren't just protecting me from Reed," Lillian said. "You were protecting me from loneliness, from fear, from a life without love." "We protected each other," Thomas replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Still do, always will." As night fell over the rocking W Ranch, stars appearing in the vast Texas sky like diamonds scattered on velvet, Lillian Wade knew with absolute certainty that the journey that had begun in grief and led her west had been, despite all its hardships, the greatest blessing of her life. In the protection of her husband's arms, surrounded by the legacy they were building for their children, she had found not just safety, but the truest kind of freedom, the freedom to love and be loved, completely and without reservation, for all the days of her life.